Now, there is a problem in our current implementation. In the users module on line 22, this is how we generate a JSON Web Token. We have the exact same code in auth module on line 21. Now look at the payload of this JSON Web Token. In this payload, currently we only have the ID property. Chances are tomorrow we're going to add another property in this payload. Maybe the name of the user, maybe their email address, maybe their role. We want to know if they are an admin user or not. With the current implementation, every time we want to change this payload, we have to remember that we have to go to another module and make the exact same change. And in the long run, you're going to forget about these requirements. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you how to encapsulate this logic in a single place. Now, where should we move this logic to? An amateur programmer may think, okay, I'm going to create a function like generate authentication token, put this function somewhere that we can reuse, maybe in another module that we can import in both auth and users modules. And with this, we have the logic in a single place. Well, that is true, that works. But with this approach, you will end up with a lot of functions hanging all over the place. In object-oriented programming, we have a principle called information expert principle. That means an object that has enough information and is an expert in a given area, that object should be responsible for making decisions and performing tasks. As a real-world example, think of a chef. A chef has the knowledge of cooking. That's why the act of cooking in a restaurant is done by a chef, not by a waiter. The waiter doesn't have the right knowledge, the right information about cooking at a restaurant. So if chef is an object, we should give the act of cooking to the chef. Now, take this principle and apply it in this code. So here, as part of creating this JSON Web Token, what do we need in the payload? We need the ID of the user. Tomorrow, we may need the name of the user or their email. So all this information is encapsulated where? In the user object. So it's the user object that should be responsible for generating this authentication token. So that function that I wrote here, generate authentication token, that function should not be hanging somewhere in a module. That should be a method in the user object. So here we have a user object that we load from the database. We need to add a method in this user object like this, user.generate authentication token. And this will give us this token. As simple as that. Now, how can we add this? We need to go to our user module where we defined the user model and make a simple change there. So let's go to user.js. All right, so here is our user model. We need to extract the definition of this schema and put it in a separate constant because we're going to work with that separately. So I'm going to select all this code here. So when creating the user model as a second argument, we pass user schema. And we have not created this yet. We're going to do that now. So constant user schema. And we set this to this expression. Like this, okay? So here's our user schema. Now we want to add a method in this schema. So user schema dot, we have a property methods. This return an object. We can add additional key value pairs in this object. So we can add a key, generate authentication or auth token. We set this to a function. So key value pair, right? When we do this, then our user object will have a method called generate authentication token. Now here in this function, we can have parameters. So if you have a parameter here, then when calling this method, we can pass arguments. In this case, we don't need any parameters. So I just need to grab this logic for generating the token, cut it from here, and move it inside this new method. So here in the payload, we need the ID of the user. How do we get that? Well, this method will be part of the user object. So in order to reference the object itself, we replace user with this. And this means here you should use the regular function syntax. You cannot replace this with an arrow function because, as I told you before, arrow functions don't have their own this. This in an arrow function references the calling function. So typically we use arrow functions for standalone functions. If you want to create a method that is part of an object, you should not use an arrow function. Now let's revert this. So here we have the token, and finally we return it. As simple as that. Now back in the authentication module. So we generate the token and then send it to the client. We need to make the same change in our users module. So users module, we delete this line and set token to user.generate auth token. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, we don't have proper IntelliSense here. So hopefully that will come sometime in the future. So finally, let's test this and make sure everything is working. So I'm going to register a new user here. Send. Okay, you see this is hanging here. So we have an issue back in the terminal. Okay, we have an unhandled promise rejection. JWT is not defined. So here in the user module, where we added this method, we are referencing JWT and config modules. So we need to import this on the top. I'm going to go back to our auth module. On the top, we no longer need these require statements. So I'm going to cut these from here and put them on top of the user module. Okay, now we should be good. So one more time, I'm going to add a new email here. Send. Done. Beautiful. And here's our authentication token.